And Jordan's fundamental concern, it seems to me, is one I fundamentally share, which is rationalism isn't enough. And it's, or let me put it another way.
Okay. But then two of you, can you both show me where it's obviously insufficient? Like
music.
But there's nothing. But again, so to say that there's more to life than being rational is not to say, and perhaps never to say, you need to run against rationality. You need to be irrational in order to get something good.
Let me express it a different way.
Yeah.
We haven't tried the purely rational approach yet, or we haven't tried it for very long.
Well, many of us have been trying for a couple of centuries at least.
Which is a blip.
Yeah.
I mean, the tiniest dot at the end of human evolution. So I think that a concern which Jordan has, and certainly a concern I have, is if we try this, we can think of all sorts of ways in which it can go wrong. If you take away all that supporting structure, you can think of any number of ways in which it can go wrong. And that I suppose that's at the root of the concern about where you might be taking us. Or to put it another way, if we enter the world that you would suggest, not everyone may necessarily come out as Sam Harris.
Well, give me one way where you think it can go wrong. And again, we can't forget your caveat, which you started with.
What if you're not very smart?
Right.
No, I don't mean.
So then you're basically saying that the stupid people need their myths. You know, we smart people on stage don't need them.
Right.
But
I actually am saying that to some degree. Look, if you're not exceptionally cognitively astute, you should be traditional and conservative. Because if you can't think well, you're going to think badly. And if you think badly, you're going to fall into trouble. And so it is definitely the case, and this has been what would you call a cliche of political belief for a long time. If you're not very smart, it's better to be conservative. Because then you do what everyone else does. And generally speaking, doing what everyone else does is the path of least error moving forward. Now, that doesn't mean that rationality is unnecessary.
Nor does it mean that all conservatives are stupid.
It doesn't mean that either, right? Precisely. It doesn't mean
that
either.
Very important caveat.
Yes,
but all conservative structures are not the same either, and that we have many warring and incompatible versions of being conservative.
True. And this is where rationality actually does play its role. Although I don't think it's best conceptualized as rationality precisely, it's definitely the case that to take Douglas's point, that we need to be bound by our traditions, but we need to be judicious in their re-representation and update, and we have to do both.
This is what, in the dialogue on religion, this is what Schopenhauer says. He describes the tragedy of the clergy.
Yeah.
He pretty much says, look, if they don't believe it, they recognize it's a very useful metaphor, but they don't need to believe it. They tell it, and he says the tragedy of the clergy is they can never admit that what they're saying is just a metaphor.
Right. So is this before or after he threw his housekeeper down the stairs?
Look, we can all find flaws.
We all have skeletons in our closet. Yeah.
But yes, there is a way in which religion is what he describes as philosophy for the masses. And that if you recognize that most people are not going to spend their lives studying philosophy, they're not going to be reading about the differences between Leibniz and Kant, that religion has to do. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with that particularly, but there's a heck of an argument within there, which a lot of people will be living their lives in.
I don't think it's a good argument if you recall or just imagine what it's like to be a child, especially from the perspective of being a parent. I have two young girls, and they're very smart young girls. I mean, they're smart, but one of them is 4.5 years old and knows almost nothing, right? So she knows what I and my wife and our society tell her at some level. I mean, at what point is she going to think for herself about these fundamental questions? And I mean, she's currently spending half the day dressed up like Batgirl or Catwoman, right? So if I told her that these superheroes were real, she would believe that for the longest time. And if we lived in a cult that thought they were real, or a whole society that by dint of its geographic or linguistic isolation managed to maintain a conversation about, in this case, Batgirl and Catwoman, that they were real and that it was absolutely important to honor them, and you'd burn in hell if you failed to do this.
Well,
we would be meeting fully grown adults who believe this sort of thing.
But it seems to me, Sam, that you bring up the superhero thing quite a bit, so I think I'll go after that directly.
Yeah.
So
then I want to.
I love superheroes.
Okay, so you make the case in A Moral Landscape that an ideal is real. Because the ideal that you define an ideal is real, and the ideal is whatever maximizes well-being and gets us away from hell. You said not only is that real, you also say that's the fundamental axiom. That's the claim in The Moral Landscape. So you do make a claim that there is a real ideal. And I would say...
I wouldn't necessarily put it that way, but we are in a circumstance where things can matter, right? Consciousness is the condition in which things can matter, where there can be a range of experiences, some of which are very, very bad. If the word bad means anything, they're bad. And some of which are very, very good, if the word good means anything. And we are navigating in that space. We can't help but navigate or seek to navigate in that space.
Right, absolutely.
And religion is one form of conversation about that navigation problem. And I would argue
let's go back to the ideal.
Often diluted one.
Well, Jordan rolls his sleeves up.
Batgirl.
He means business now.
Batgirl.
But
Batgirl and Catwoman are approximations to a higher ideal. That's what they are.
And to return to this with a biblical idea, I'm fairly sure from personal experience that a lot of parents are perfectly content with bringing their children up vaguely within the story they've inherited. And at some point, the children realize that the fairy doesn't bring them money when their teeth fall out. And at some point, maybe around the same time or a bit later, they discover that Santa Claus doesn't really come down the chimney. And at some point, they realize that actually the whole religious thing is a kind of metaphor, but it's got them through the formative years in some way, often with terrible damage along the way. I concede that. But also with something else. And I'm struck by the number of people, and this is why I share some of what I think is Jordan's concern about the possibility of the world you're envisaging, which is, I can think of a lot of parents now, in my country and other countries as well, who I'm just very struck. They themselves are kind of baby boomer or 60s atheists, humanists, whatever. And I start to notice, for instance, that they're enrolling their children in Christian schools. And I say to them, why are you doing this? And they have fairly coherent arguments along the lines of the one I've just had. Look, I don't particularly believe this myself, but I think it's a pretty good way to bring up the kids. It's a structure of a kind. And I'm not sure, I can find all sorts of flaws in that. But enough people are doing it that it's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, well, I would say yes. It speaks to a real failure of imagination and effort in the secular community to produce truly non-embarrassing alternatives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I want to talk about a remarkable phenomenon that is going on in Asia and Africa, namely the large-scale conversion of Muslims to Christianity. There was a complaint by a guy on Al Jazeera who said that by his count, 6 million Muslims are converting to Christianity each year.
Christians have been saying two things. Number one, God is eternal. Eternal meaning not living forever on and on and on. Eternal in the sense of outside of time. And this concept of eternity, which seemed from a scientific point of view incoherent, now makes complete sense. If God is outside the universe, he's outside of time.
Far from being unable to escape God, there is a very real contingent of non-believers, and I would count myself among their number, who are unable by any means to discover him, who seek and do not find, who knock and receive, as it were, no answer. I think it would be great if God existed. I really do. I would absolutely love to escape death. I would relish being the recipient of unconditional love. Less selfishly, I would love to be able to worship that which deserves to be worshipped. I just don't think it's true. Now, try as I might, look where I can, I find no response, no hint, nothing.